Hello everybody, and today's video I'm going to show you how we can use triggers to trigger different events in our Unity game, in our VR project. And then in the second part, we are going to take what we learned here and use that to trigger an event within NPC to start a conversation using the dialogue editor and the NPC that we get off of Mixamo. So let's get into it. Okay, everyone, here we are in our Unity 2021 VR project that we set up in a previous video. And here we just have a cube and three spheres. Here, just a basic on a plane, just a basic scene setup here. The first thing I am going to do here is to set up my locomotion on my player so I can walk around. And I can easily do that just by going to my XR rig, right clicking on XR rig, going down to XR, then locomotion system action base, and you can see it added this locomotion system to my XR origin. And if you look over in the inspector, you can see it already comes with if you want to set up the teleportation, you can. Then it already comes with the snap turn provider. I'm just going to use a reference for the right hand. Click on this little circle here. And if I scroll down, since we are using the default input actions, they already have these default inputs here. So I'm just going to look for right hand locomotion turn. And to be able to walk around, what I'm going to do is go to add components and start typing in continuous. And I'm going to add the continuous move provider action based. And then for the locomotion system that it's looking for, just going to grab and drag this locomotion system here in the inspector and drag it down to where it says system. And then I'm going to be able to walk with my left hand. And you can flip these if you want to turn with your left hand and walk with your right hand. You just have to flip these around. So I'm going to go to use reference and same thing, click on the circle. Since we're using the default input actions, there should be a XR left hand locomotion move. And I have a previous video that I did, but it's a little old and it has some of the older terminology in it. If you want me to update that, all the steps and everything is the same to set this up, and everything is still there. It's just like some of the wording has changed. So if you want me to make a new video of that, just let me know. So now that that's set up, we are able to walk around in our scene. So let's get back to our trigger detections and our colliders and things like that. So if we look at our cubes and our spheres here, we can see that they all have some type of collider on them. And for collision detection to work, you need two things. One, all the objects need some type of collider, like you see here. These have sphere colliders on them. And the cube has a box collider on it. But the other thing you need is a rigid body. And only one other object needs to have the rigid body. And most of the time, that's probably going to be your player. So what we're going to do, we're going to go to the camera offset because this is the actual part that's going to move around. The XR origin is pretty much like at a fixed location. And when you start moving around, it doesn't move. But we want to put our box collider on the camera offset. So let's click on camera offset and we're going to go to add component. So like I said, two things you need is some type of collider and only one other object needs a rigid body. So let's type in box collider first. So we added our box collider and then you can see we have our collider there. And then we're going to add a rigid body. And if you don't know what the collider is pretty much the physical space that it can take up and detect if something is, it can be used to detect if something is touching it, but it's like the physical space that it takes up in your game. And if you turn off the box collider, it pretty much makes the item able to walk through. So if I didn't have a box collider on this cube here, and with my XR origin, with my box sliding rigid body, if I came up here and just walked through it, then I'll be able to walk through it because it doesn't have any type of collider to stop me from penetrating it. But since I do have a rigid body, it's showing that this is a physical location that can be taken up. So the rigid body that we have here, it pretty much detects the physics and controls the physical objects. You can see it has mass. It can control over here. We have the mass, the drag, some gravity. The kinematics allows you to turn the physics on and off. And then you have like a collision detection here as well. So we have a rigid body and box collider here. And now if we did go into VR, what will happen is if we try to walk on the walk through this cube, it would pretty much prevent us. And this is a way you can also make like invisible walls in your games too. So if I wanted to make invisible walls or areas that the player can't go, all I have to do is set up the box slider enriched body on my player, and then on my walls that I want to be invisible, I can just or the areas I want restricted, I can just put box colliders on them and stretch them out to the size that I need them, and then just turn off the mesh, and now there I have an invisible wall. So what another thing about the colliders that we have, so if we look at the cube, we can look at the box collider. There's a section here that's called is trigger. There's a little checkbox that says is trigger. And this allows us to pretty much turn off the physical aspect of the box. So like we said, it can make it as a wall so you can't penetrate it. But what we can do, if we set it as a trigger, we can still use this collision detection and then make an event happen when this box is the text that has been crossed by the player. So if we set it, and that's what we're going to do here today, is set this as a trigger. So when the player triggers, walks in this box in this area, then it's going to trigger our spheres to activate. So what we want to do is just click on this box and say is trigger, and then we're going to make a script to handle that interaction and tell it what to do when that trigger is called. And if you want to learn more about the colliders and the triggers, you can go to the documentation here and just look up the introduction to collisions, and it tells you all about the collisions, colliders, and triggers as well. There's a good matrix here at the bottom that tells you how things will be triggered and what collisions can be detected and how. And so you can just use this. So if you're doing triggers and collisions, you can know what kind of rigid body and collider setup you need for those triggers to be detected. And it's good if you get stuck somewhere, you don't know why something's not being triggered or something, you can just come back here and just cross-reference your items to make sure it's in one of the boxes get triggered. So we are going to go back to Unity. Here we are back in Unity. And like I said, we're going to create a script to handle this trigger detection and allow our spheres to appear. So let's right click, go to create, C# script, and let's call this sphere, well, let's call it cube trigger. We're going to put this on our cube, the actual item that's going to detect the collision. That's the item we're going to put it on. And we're going to double click on this to open it up in Visual Studio. All right, so here we are in Visual Studio. So for this, we won't need our start and update, so we can just go ahead and get rid of those. But what we will need is a reference to our player. So we can say public game object and player. And we'll also need references to those spheres that we want to activate. So we're going to say public game object. And since we have 3 of those, we're going to make this an array. So public game object spheres. All right, so now we have a reference to the items we want to detect and activate. So to be able to use the triggers in the colliders, Unity already has functions for those, and all we have to do is say private. And for reference, if you want to do a collision, all you have to do is say on collision. And you see on collisions right here, on collision enter, on collision exit, and on collision stay. And then alternatively, since we're doing triggers, they have the same thing for triggers. So you have your on trigger enter, on trigger exit, and then there's also an on trigger stay. So you might be asking, what's the difference between on trigger enter, on trigger exit, and on trigger stay? So on trigger enter, you can see this says it's called when another collider has entered this space. So if another collider has entered my space, then I want something to happen. On trigger exit is the opposite of that. When a object is in my space and it leaves, then I want something to happen. And then you have the on trigger stay. And the stay is something that's going to be called once per frame while these objects are touching each other. So this might be good for like if you want like fire damage maybe. That's a good example. So a player runs into an area where there's like fire, and you want to like continuously take away from their health. So as long as they're in the fire, then you want to keep subtracting from their health or something like that, where you want to use the on trigger stay. But what we're going to do, we're going to say if a player enters this area, then we want our cubes to activate. So we're going to go with an on trigger enter. So, and then also if you do put that, all I did was to get that to autofill. I go private void on trigger enter and just hit tab. You can see it autofills for me to put the whole function there. I'm just going to delete that. So here, pretty much I'm saying if on trigger something comes in my space, then I want something to happen. And I can just put anything in this box. So if I just put anything here or whatever I type in between these two curly brackets, it's going to automatically happen for any object that enters my space. But what we want to do, if a player enters our space, that's what we want to make something happen. So to do that, what we need is an if statement. So if we say if other dot game object double equals player, then we want something to happen. So this line of code is saying if the other game object equals player, which we have a reference to, then we want something to happen. And what we want to happen is to activate these spheres. So we can just say spheres, and since they're an array, we need our box brackets, and then we can just say dot set active and set that to true. And then I'm just going to hit Control D 2 times to duplicate that line and just change this to 1 and 2 since we have 3 of those. So we're saying if the other game object that enters our space is the player, then we want to activate these spheres. And to take this a step further, we're going to say private void on trigger exit. And we're going to do the same thing. If other, if I can spell it, there we go, dot game object double equals player. And in this instance, we're going to turn them off. So we're just going to say spheres, don't forget our box bracket, dot set active, and say false, so turn them off. Double duplicate those 2 times, say 1 and 2. And I'm going to save that. So what we're saying here, if the other game object is the player, then we want to activate these spheres. And if he comes in our area, then we want to activate it. If they leave the area, then we want to deactivate it. So let's save this and go back to Unity. So here we are back in Unity, and we want to put that script that we just made onto our cube here, because that's what we want to detect if we enter our exit. So that's going to be our area that we want to enter our exit. So we want to grab this script here and just put it on our cube. And you can see it's looking for a reference to our player. So let's just grab our camera offset, which is where we put that rigid body in that box collider, and put that on where it is for our player. And you can rename that if you want. That makes it better for you. We just call this the player there. And now on our cube, we have a reference to that player. And now we just need a reference to the spheres. So I'm just going to add 3 here. And I'm just going to drag those over. Another quick tip, if you have a lot of things you need to put in an array, instead of dragging them over one by one, what I could have done here is locked my inspector, highlight these 3 spheres, and then drag them all over to these spheres, and just make sure you elements are empty there. There we go. So yeah, just drag them all over to the array that you want to put them in. But just remember to unlock your inspector once you're done with that. All right, so those seem to be set up, and also make sure your cube is set to be on trigger. So now that we have all that there, I think we're ready to go and test this. So One thing I did forget to do is to turn off the spheres. So we want these to start deactivated, so when we enter the space, they activate. So let me go ahead and turn those off there, and now we are good to go into VR. So here we go. So I have this cube here, and if I walk into it, you see they activate the spheres. And you can use this for pretty much anything. So if I had this area and if I wanted some sounds to play, then I can have set up some audio to this. And if I wanted some particle systems to play or something like that, then I could do that. So it's a pretty versatile, easy way to set up triggers and actions. So like I said, if I wanted some audio to play, I can just come in here and say public audio source and call it sounds. And I can come down here and say sounds.play. Play, sorry. Say sound.play. And just anything. If I want something like the spheres, something to pop up out of nowhere, and have it pop up, have sounds play. If I want to spawn enemies, so yeah, it's very versatile, very easy. Once the player crosses this threshold, then it can activate whatever you want to activate. If I wanted to make this invisible, all I had to do was just turn off this mesh render, and now this is an invisible, pretty much like a tripwire to activate something that I want to activate in my game. And in part two, we're going to take this a step further and see how we can use it for some interaction. So thank you for watching this one, and I will see you in the next one.